topics in today's museum studies. I would like to thank you, both of you, and Gridthiya very much for making this talk happen. Before we start, I would like to briefly introduce to our speakers today. So, Dr. Friedrich von Bose is a cultural anthropologist, museologist, and curator. He is currently a senior researcher and lecturer at the Institute for Social Anthropology and Empirical Studies, Popular Culture at the University of Zurich, with a focus on museum studies, anthropology of the political, memory culture, and cultural participation. For many years, he has been an active participant in debates about colonial collections and debates about and the responsibility of museums in accounting for their historical involvement in colonialism. He sees curating itself as a research practice, just as he is interested in the question of how research can be conceived with, and in formats of curation. Most recently, Friedrich was head of research and exhibition at the three Museums of the State Ethnographic Collection of Saxony in Leipzig, Dresden, and Hermann from 2020 to 2023, where he has been jointly responsible for a fundamental renewal process. This previous project includes the planning and implementation of the Humboldt University of Berlin's exhibition space in the Humboldt Forum with the inaugural exhibition After Nature, in addition to various associations in international research networks. He has been a jury member of the European Museum of the Year Award since 2022, and editor for the online magazine Gridthiya Gaweewong since 2024. And the next speaker is Jason Lee. He is an artist and a writer. He is the author of 4 poetry books, including the Gaudy Boy Poetry Prize finalist in short Future Now. His art is recently seen in the Institutum, the 5th Koshi Mysteries Biennale, and called Photo Festival, and will be featured in Kaohsiung Museum of Fine Art, HKW Berlin, and the upcoming Changwon Sculpture Biennale. He is the 2023 Asymmetry Foundation Scholar and a 2024 Mercator Artist Fellow in Berlin. Curated projects include The Measure of Our Dwelling, Singapore as Unhome, IFA Berlin and Stuttgart 2015. Stories We Tell to Scare Ourselves, MoCA Taipei 2019. Ko Muang Hao, The Past and Coming Melt, Gray Projects 2019. Walk, Don't Run, Island-wide Singapore 2021 and 2023. So now I'd like to invite Gridthiya on stage to give us a brief introduction about this talk and the collaboration.
Hi everyone. So I'm more than happy, to have these two important persons, artists and researchers from Berlin and also Singapore, to join us today. The first time we met was in Berlin, right, through the Goethe Institute, and it was a collaboration project that they brought curators from South Asia with the German curators and researchers, and we managed to visit the Humboldt Forum before, under construction, and it was super controversial. And I'm really happy to hear, from Fred, who will share us this kind of inside story, gossiping, and everything about the Berlin art scene and Germany, and also the museum, because he's in part of the museum, European Museum Forum. I want to know more about that as well. So I want to know everything, what you did. He's actually started with the Humboldt University and then he moved to Zurich. So that was very interesting, move, from one very prestigious museum and to the university, as a lecturer. So I think the format is like Fred will give a lecture or presentation about 35 to 40 minutes, and then Jason will respond, and you will tell us why you have many kind of cross paths between you and your practice, and also Fred's exhibitions and project. And then I will, they will discuss among themselves, and then I will jump in after that. And then please feel free to ask the questions, or share something. And it was really funny because Ajahn Win, from Silamakan, I sent him like, please spread the word, and he was like, oh my God, your topic is super niche, like, how can I share this title? And I think the provenance is very important, from German and Swiss perspective, right? And then I will share you, like, because from Thailand we just had a very important two sculptures from the Met, the golden one. So it's like the other kind of the way around, right? So the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gridthiya, for having me, for the invitation to speak here tonight. Thank you, Nolan, also for the kind introduction, and thank you, special thanks to Jason to do this with me tonight. He came all the way from Singapore, and I'm, as a disclaimer to start with, I can very much relate to this idea of the specificity of the topic, and that it's kind of very narrow. I will try, in my part of the talk, I will try to make it as much relevant as possible. And as Gridthiya also said just now, I think, even though it sounds very narrow from the title, I think the whole questions about provenance and the debate about restitution in the, I would say, German-speaking context, which includes Germany, Switzerland, also Austria, of course, is very politically relevant for context also beyond. And the question will be also in the discussion how we can make it possibly relevant for a mutual discussion.
So I'll just say quickly that thank you and to Gridthiya and to Thompson for inviting us. I'm very happy to be here to support Fred. I've interacted with Frank in Germany and also Stephen work in Zurich. And I thought it was already. And so I'm really here to draw questions and have a conversation that I hope folks here on the floor can join in at any time. And then we'll hopefully open up to a wider discussion among all of us. And so I see my role here really as an initiator of a conversation. Yeah. So.
And maybe also to add to this, Jason has been to Germany and also Switzerland several times, and we've met and discussed a lot of topics there together. So I chose examples for my talk that will also enable you to relate and ask questions, and we'll have a conversation. And maybe to start, just by way of introduction, to also to tell you what I'm about to speak about, is to first lay out a little bit the cultural political field in which the debates about the significance of colonial history for museum have kind of been made apparent, which especially relate to ethnographic museums and how they have changed in the past, let's say, 20 years in the German context, from which I'm primarily speaking here. And this also includes the more recent developments in the attempts to account for and to work through the coloniality of the collections in all its ambivalence, also by the museums in their resistance against calls for accounting for this past and of distinguishing themselves, of being very progressive about it. And I think this is something, when you say, let's hear all about the gossip of the Humboldt Forum, I'm very happy to talk about this one, as you may imagine. And if there's any questions about it, I'm happy to discuss these things. Because, and this is maybe a little spoiler, I'm going to go into that a little bit more later on, the Humboldt Forum quite involuntarily has been kind of the catalyst of debates of colonial collections in Germany and beyond in the past, let's say, 20 years. So to relate to that debate is really relating to the much broader debate about which we would refer in German usually as colonial collections, which of course is very reductive or about to say. Yes, and relevant for the German context is also that in Germany we have the highest density of ethnographic museums in the whole world. And this is very much related to German colonial history. And this is maybe something to have in mind. Before this backdrop, I want to discuss a couple of current issues and you could say fields of tensions with regards to ethnographic museums and museum practice, specifically then with relevance to the restitution debates in recent years, something that wouldn't have come up as a debate without many years of social justice activism about museums, but also a debate amongst professional museum networks such as ICOM, such as several of the museum associations who really have put up this question of museum ethics with regards to provenance, research and restitution on the cultural political agenda in recent years. I myself am tackling this issue from the perspective of a scholar of museums as much as a curator, and I have been actively participating in these debates for the last at least 15 years. And what I would like to do, I mean, I'm going to speak about the Humboldt Forum, I'm also going to speak about this context of the Grassi Museum and the, as Nubin said in the introduction, the state ethnographic collections in Saxony, one of the East German states that is currently undergoing huge political shifts. There's going to be state elections this fall where we are probably going to face a right extremist government to take office, or at least with the participation of the right extremist party AfD, which will of course have huge consequences on the cultural field. And what you can see here is the Grassi Museum, where I had my office in the past 3 years, and where we underwent quite a foundational restructuring of the museum. Yes, so a little bit about the cultural political context in the German and the wider European field. A lot is happening there with regards to the public accounting for collections with a history of colonial appropriation, and why I chose to speak about or to include Switzerland in the title is that the development has been starting there in recent years too. One prime example is that in the past 3 or 4 years, 8 museums in Switzerland have collaborated on working about the provenances of their collection of Benin bronzes. Just a quick question into the audience: who of you are familiar with what the Benin bronzes as a subject or as an object kind of art category? Some, okay, not all. So I will explain a little bit in a bit. In the German context, which is the main field of reference for me now, the development with regards to collections from colonial context has been taking place somewhat longer, although long can be relative in relation to how long the debates or the calls for accounting for the colonial must have been going on. I'm showing you here a slide of protests against the Humboldt Forum, which Gridthiya has already mentioned, and those protests, those debates have put the issue on the political agenda quite a bit. I'm going to jump over this. You can see here the Humboldt Forum in its full beauty as it has been installed since it has been opened in 2021, whose planned relocation of the ethnological collections from the peripheral museum context in Berlin, outside of Berlin, into the Humboldt Forum has been really sparking the debates about collections, ethnographic collections that have been primarily amassed, you could say, in Germany during the times of colonialism, colonial power. You could say it has kind of served as a catalyst of criticism for the post-colonial debates on collections in Germany, but also beyond. The high-profile resignation of art historian Bénédicte Savoy from the Humboldt Forum's expert committee in 2017 gave the whole debate quite a big spark and increased the media attention on the Humboldt Forum exponentially. The headline says the Humboldt Forum is like Chernobyl. What she meant by this is like that the Humboldt Forum manages to kind of build a concrete layer around the debates that will not make it able to debate publicly. And this was her kind of headline of leaving the expert committee. And by latest then, the issue was on the table publicly in the national media. It has been before, but not with that much attention. Another important moment was the French President Emmanuel Macron's speech in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso in November 2017, so in the same year, in which he declared the return of objects stolen from French museum collections in the colonial context to be a national task, and he said that he declared that in front of students. And following this, Macron commissioned Bénédicte Savoy and the Senegalese economist and writer Ferdinand Sarr to conduct a study outlining the ways in which African cultural heritage has ended up in European museums and how restitution could be practically carried out. And they have published this in German in this publication. This is the German version of the English report that you can all download online. So this gave this whole debate a huge new momentum, and it also entered, you could say, popular culture. You can see here to the left Trevor Noah taking up the issue in the same year in The Daily Show. You can see a German stand-up comedian, Jan Böhmermann, who interviewed Bénédicte Savoy also. And I found it, as a cultural studies scholar, I found it very interesting how this issue that you could say is quite niche in the cultural political context became publicly so heavily discussed and politicized. And it also entered the political realm by way of the two governing parties, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, in 2018, because of the debates about the Humboldt Forum, making the discussion about colonial history part of government policy in 2018. So in the coalition agreement, it was put down that museums, in one way or other, being related to colonial history by means of their collections, would have to really kind of go into their history and work on the provenances of their objects, that there would be funding, and this was, of course, enabled also museums to apply for this and to engage more with their history, including ourselves at the Grassi Museum, which I just showed this image. We were able to be funded by the Federal Cultural Foundation for 3 years with the project Reinventing Grassi, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. So as you can see, there's a lot of movement in the discussion with real political effects that also led to a change within museums with regards to the relevance that is attributed to history, to colonial history. And this has not been for so long. Only a few years before, the situation looked like museums didn't really feel the necessity to engage with that history. You can see this with one slide, with one quote that I'm showing here, which I translated, and it goes from a PR brochure of the Humboldt Forum, where the Prussian Heritage Foundation publicly stated in 2011, that was when the scientific foundation of the Ethnological Museum in Berlin was laid in around the turn of the 20th century, and it was done so legally. The Berlin museums are therefore the rightful owners of their holdings. This was something to be said publicly by the responsibles of the Humboldt Forum about 10 years ago. This wouldn't be said today anymore. In 2017, so shortly after Benedikt Savoy's high-profile resignation from the Humboldt Forum's advisory board, the attitude among some of the ethnological museums was that colonialism and its significance for museums was also just a temporary phenomenon. The invitation to an event entitled "Is Provenance Research Part of the Humboldt Forum's DNA?" that was kind of the public event being invited to by the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation in 2016, began with the words, and I'm quoting here again, "It was the summer slump topic of 2017, German colonialism, ethnological collections, and the Humboldt Forum." When I bring this quote in the German-speaking context, people usually have to laugh quite loudly, because today this topic of colonial history is so overarching and everybody kind of knows about the significance that in 2017 somebody, like the biggest cultural institution in Germany, is saying this publicly. It is kind of funny, and I can relate why nobody's laughing here now, but it's just to give you an idea, it's about the absurdity of that comment only a couple of years ago. And as a cultural studies scholar, I mean, I find it really interesting in this kind of long delay development of the discourse about this history. Yes, so a lot has happened since then, and importantly, the projects within the museums, they have taken shape also by means of activist struggles, post-colonial debates and criticism, also from the academic and artistic field, and this is something we may be conversing in a little bit. Because I think it's important to mention that the pressure didn't only come from outside the museums, but also from inside the museums, from like the curators in the museums who do find it very important, of course, to engage with that history, and who finally kind of, have managed also to do projects and kind of to develop this perspective kind of bottom up from within the museums. Yes, so, and the question of course is like whether museums just follow a trend, because it has now kind of becoming part of like the status quo to speak about colonial history, or whether they actually engage in the change. And there has been a lot of theorizing about whether you could coin this transformism as theory, as theorist Nora Sternfeld, for example, has done so with regards to this development, or whether it's actually really an investment in meaningful change. I'm speaking now a little bit about the Grassi Museum, which you know and which we may be able to talk about in a bit. So we in Saxony, and especially at the Grassi Museum, really kind of took up this point and asked ourselves, how could we work with and through the collections with all their complex histories of entanglement. There, in Germany, you would say geteilte Geschichten. Geteilt, it has a dual meaning in the sense of shared and divided histories, and at the same time approach them with a relational view that is interested in the global routes and transcultural interdependencies. And in the process, in the processes within which certain forms, styles, practices of use emerge in local contexts, but which are always located with a larger exchange relationship. And you can see here, I'm just showing one slide of the museum which kind of conveys like the old-fashioned style of the ethnographic in the ethnographic museums. This is an interesting example because it is this so-called mimetic display of, in German it says, Leben in einem indischen Dorf, life in an Indian village. As you can see, the display here, it doesn't convey much about the interesting parts that is also part of this, because it was a collaborative project with people from a place in Gujarat in India coming to Leipzig to build this roundhouse, but kind of, you know, creating a sense of what India is in a German museum that is very problematic. So this is a display which some people love if they know a little bit more about the history. Some people love because it fulfills this kind of exoticist desire for a kind of rural India, and many people also hate because it entails this history of exoticism. And I think it's very interesting. You want to?
Just also to give a little more context around this presentation, this particular village presentation abuts another space that is focused on Southeast Asia. And that also partly explains why we've been having a conversation. I've been really looking at the German holdings of artifacts and materials and objects from this part of the world, beginning from the 19th century through explorers, traders, and folks who somehow obtained these objects and then brought them back to Germany and Europe. And so this Southeast Asia exhibit that is right next to this also has a very strong focus on the figure of the cannibal as a way to think about Southeast Asia. So, you know, there's on one side this one figure, the cannibal, and then on the other side is the villager and the primitive and so on. Yeah. So just so you to understand what you might observe as you walk through this space.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for pointing this out. And I mean, you have been there and you remember like how much the whole the path through the exhibitions is conceived as a path through the world. So you go. This is a very classical way of museum ethnographic curatorial work traditionally in Germany and way beyond. That you have the world in the museum and you can enable visitors to wander the world. And this is something that always interested me also, what this world is. I mean, I know that in Southeast Asia you also have the notion of world museums. I do think they mean something different here. In Europe, world oftentimes stands for, or mostly it stands for the world outside Europe. So you have very specific art histories, European art histories, and then you have the world, which is like the ethnographic world outside of Europe. And you can see this in the Humboldt Forum very well, because the Humboldt Forum is the space that has always been declared as the space of the world cultures, vis-a-vis Museum Island in Berlin that is suddenly appearing as European, even though it used to be a very universal museum, following a universal museum idea. So this question of world and worlding is something that I find really interesting when you go through that museum. And this is something also that we tried to work against in our kind of curatorial redevelopment of the museum. And one thing that we wanted to engage in was really a processual way of curating. So while we had the ability to rework all the exhibitions on 4,000 square meters, we decided to reopen in stages and have the old exhibition parts still visible while opening new exhibition parts. This is something that we decided to keep on showing, but installing small artistic interventions that would add layers to this and kind of address this exoticist gaze that becomes relevant here, but to have visitors understand what the history of the ethnographic gaze is as it has been here since this year. You know, it's still there and people still love it and go there.
Yeah. And I think it's also one thing that Gracie had to respond to because of this exhibition format, because the show that is here is up for years, right? It's sometimes been over a decade. So that's a question of then if this is going to persist in cultural conversation and as an almost contemporary artifact, exhibition artifact, then how do you keep talking to it? How do you keep addressing things in it? How do you keep addressing it?
And also annoying lots of people with it, because this long history of the mode of ethnographic museums, really people are used to this. People go with their grandchildren to these museums because they have been going there when they were a child themselves, and nothing much has changed since then. So if you take that away from them, they're really, how do you say, like a politically correct word? They're really frustrated, some of them. But what it also creates, you create, of course, other people's interest, and this is something that is the reward, which is rewarding, that you feel like people are, realizing that you do work differently. I'm just showing images of an exhibition just adjacent, but also of fixation. And this is a space that is called Care Room, where we also, when we have visitors who want to look at certain kinds of objects that are not on display for all kinds of reasons, also ethical reasons, they can engage with the objects here. This is a delegation of Sami representatives, so the indigenous population of Northern Europe, Scandinavia, and this is specifically representatives of the Sami government of Finland and directors of Sami museums who came to the museum because in our holdings we had drums from Sami spiritual objects from the 17th century. You can see in the foreground a drum from the 1680s with engravings on the snare, and this is a space for taking on these objects and doing work about them. And oftentimes these meetings are the first instance in a longer collaboration process where restitution can be one kind of result. Yes, so I'm jumping over some slides here, and I want to go into one example that we have also been in conversation about, which is the return of the Benin bronzes. And as I'm aware that some of you are not familiar what the Benin bronzes are, these are objects several hundred years old, and I'm not sure whether I'm able to describe them well in English. They're plaques, and they are not made from bronze. It's rather like an art historical term. They're brass objects, mostly from the palace of the Oba, of the king of the Benin kingdom in present-day Nigeria, which was looted, which was attacked by the British colonial troops in 1897 as part of a so-called punitive expedition. So-called punitive, it was of course the rhetoric of the British to call it punitive. It was basically conquering the kingdom of Benin and plundering the palace and burning everything down. And so those objects have been appraised internationally since then as highest art objects, with coming from the 15th, 16th centuries. And they were looted by the British, brought to London, and then circulated on the private art market towards museum in Europe, but also in the United States, and amongst private owners. So those objects are part of the palace of Benin and tell like a royal history, basically. So they are, you could say, they employ a visual history of the kingdom of Benin. And on the private art market, one of these objects is worth several millions of euros or dollars, oftentimes. They're dispersed across museums in Europe and the States, as I said, and they have been kind of the prime example of colonial loot in recent debates, because of their very special status also. And for another reason also, because the loot of the Benin Palace is so well recorded, and the catalogs of the private art dealers dealing with these objects are so well, you can really trace back the provenance of these objects very well, and that's why they've become such an important example of colonial loot, which puts up a lot of other questions that we may go into detail later. But one important aspect of this history is that they have been kind of the prime example. Also, there have been restitution requests from Nigeria by latest since the independence in the 60s, but even before then. So there has been decades of restitution requests, and in Germany, and this is internationally been very kind of a big thing. In Germany, there has been it has been put up on the high political agenda to invest in restitution in only a couple of years back in 2021. So this is why I'm taking this as an example, because it puts up a lot of questions to be reflecting about in terms of like, what does this mean for the issue of restitution, for the issue of what Benedict Sauer has been calling a relational ethic together with Tsar. And what you can see here is the display in the Leipzig Museum as it was there until July of 2021, where it was already, the theme of restitution was already an issue there. It was a display with the objects kind of conveying the message, look, we have them here on display, they're ready to be returned once there is the political will. So in going to a specific moment in the April of 2021, the State Minister of Culture under Chancellor Merkel in Germany called together the directors of 5 museums in Germany who are holding prominently Benin bronzes and the representatives of their governing institutions for a meeting about the Benin bronzes. It was decided at this meeting that the respective museums and their governing bodies would work towards substantial and timely restitution of the bronzes. And we as State Ethnographic Collections, our director, Leontine Meyer-van Mensch, was part of that meeting and co-signed a declaration according to which the first objects are to be restituted to Nigeria in 2022, which was a big political decision, preparation of a decision. But the actual decision on both federal and state levels was still due. And this was for us a very interesting moment, because we were in the process of reconceiving the exhibitions, and we were in a state a free state of Saxony with a very conservative government. So we were wondering, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to convince our political body to actually invest in restitution, something that we as museums wanted already for a long time, but where we had to convince, of course, those political players to follow up on. And what we decided about in the process of redevelopment of the exhibitions to take out all the Benin bronzes from display and not exhibit them until this political decision was being made. And this is what you can see, part of one section of the text is that we said we want to take them off display and rather talk about what does restitution mean for us as a museum, and how can we actually go beyond restitution. So we talk more about the meaning of Benin bronzes in Leipzig and the kind of the presence of the history of the Benin bronzes in Saxony, in Germany. One interesting example is that you have a stamp here from the GDR in the 1980s depicting, or no, actually in the 1970s, depicting a Benin bronze on a stamp. So it is something people know. What we decided was to curate an exhibition that is more concerned with the presence and absence of the bronzes, and we invited Emeka Ogbo, the artist Emeka Ogbo, I'm sure some of you will know him, to do a work on the Benin bronzes, which which is called At the Threshold. In this, so this is basically the space in which he took photos that he took of the Bini bronze, well, that he had taken of the Bini bronzes in the storages of the museum, and to work with this notion of presence and absence of the bronzes in the exhibition. Not present them physically, but present images of the bronzes coming out of the walls in a very darkened space with a very ambient sound installation, and really playing with this question of presence and absence. And here you can see. So,
No, so
no, it's photographs. It's photographs that are backlit, and that you can see in kind of huge. So they are much bigger than the actual physical objects. So in a way, we played with this question of presence and representation and hyper visibility, because what people said, well, you're not going to show the bronzes, but you could also say, well, we are showing oversized images of the bronzes. So really kind of playing with this notion.
yeah, so and also prior to you entering the space, America had curated in some ways kind of like a timeline,
Yes.
right, of how he's worked with these objects and what's happened to these objects.
Yes.
So then after that, you enter the space, and which is quite dark, and these photographs that are larger than life size, they kind of glow at you, and they're very dimly lit. So even though you know kind of what they are, a lot of people walk up close to them. So that's my experience of it, and then of course there is the key component, of course, is the audio.
Yeah. The audio that is kind of, it's very ambient, but it's also taking up this question of conflict, of this debate. So you're inside the space and you're in the middle of like a kind of an argument, which was not really like anything audible to understand, but you can see you're in the middle of something. And what he writes is, I mean, you can read it yourself, the uncertainty as to whether the spotlight is communicative of their return or a fading into an unseen archive is a lingering debate within the post-colonial discourse. The series consciously denies our physical interaction with the bronzes, seeing them in this capacity, a step towards defining their accessibility in the Western sphere. Seen and unseen, optimism merges with an unerring bleakness, the future of these artifacts are part of a continuing dialogue. There's another part of his work that was in Dresden, so in another museum of the state museums of the Dresden State Art Museums, which was also one of these images in the Albertinum. We're showing 6, and there was another one in Dresden, and it was advertised with this poster. Geh zurück, wo du herkommst. It means in English, go back to where you're from. And it has obviously a very double meaning. It's known as a racist slur towards people to go back to where they are from. And here it's kind of spray painted onto a poster of the Bini bronzes. So we kind of see a both striking and subtle negotiation of the question of whereabouts and return with reference to a racist language that is part of everyday life for many people, especially in Saxony. And the overlapping of I'm going into this in a moment. I want to show another image. This was 1 year before, where Emeka also did a poster campaign in Dresden, which was a missing campaign. It was kind of the idea to tell the Dresden audience that they're really kind of implicated in this history of loot and the presence of the Bini bronzes in Dresden, in Saxony, whereas people in Nigeria wouldn't be as wouldn't have as much proximity to these objects. one thing that made this very, very kind of in a kind of important poster kind of retrospectively was that on the very day in the end of 2022, when the first bronzes were returned, you can see this here. The first bronzes were being picked up just before Christmas from our museums, and together with bronzes from other museums, they were being returned in a government airplane to Nigeria on a state visit of Federal Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock. And you can imagine how it was like just before Christmas. I got this phone call from the Federal Foreign Office, like how can we manage to pick up these bronzes and have them driven to the Berlin, the military airport part of the Berlin International Airport, and then transported to Nigeria. It was an interesting experience to organize this together. You can see here the director, Leontine Mange van Mensch, shaking hands with the person of Schenker Logistics who was picking up the boxes of part of this long history of debate about restitution. What was not so it was a very kind of also publicly, it was a very kind of PR event of the Federal Foreign Minister to go to I think it was Lagos, the airport where she's arriving and being greeted by the Nigerian political counterparts. What was not so publicly visible, that on the very same day that this return of the bronzes happened, there was a mass deportation of Nigerian citizens from Germany to Nigeria, which was just made this whole thing very kind of ambivalent. You had on the one hand the big PR related return of the mini bronzes, and at the same time the deportation of Nigerians from Germany, which oftentimes, as most of you will know, happens under police force and was not part of the public attention. So the simultaneity of such different practices of return on the same day, you could say, is inherently cynical. It must first be comprehended. The media effectively staged restitution of Benin bronzes on the one hand and of the deportation away from the public eye reveal, you can say, two aspects of one and the same discourse on belonging. So it is, and I'm quoting here Sylvie Chakalike, who is also sitting in the audience, who's writing that the overlapping of the two pictorial levels, you could say, with Sylvie, testifies to the unbearable simultaneity, which is not a matter of rhetorical coincidence. Rather, it is a part of social figurations, of networks of relationships and power that connect things and people inextricably with each other. It is thus an element both of ethnological collections and of the conjunction of global history and the history of things that is manifested in them. So the simultaneity of the forced return of people on the one hand, often unannounced for those affected and carried out with the use of police force, as I just said, and the long negotiated restitution of cultural objects on the other, makes clear what Chakalike describes, namely that the definition of what a legitimate refugee is, who has the right to be saved and whose deportation is legal and justifiable, is closely connected with ethnographic museums of knowledge, collection practices, and the logic of representation. And I think, and I don't want to take up too much time because we're going to be in conversation, but I think this shows really well like the kind of intricacies of museums and their investment in restitution politics and what kind of issues they have to have in mind in a larger societal context where we have a migration discourse and a restitution discourse that are oftentimes not being thought together, but they need to be thought together also with respect to the cultural political situations that museums inextricably are part, especially in a context like Saxony or other German states where we are about to face a shift towards a right-wing government in the very near future, where these issues are going to be even much more linked together. And from, I think, like the perspective also as a cultural anthropologist and someone interested in the anthropology of policy, in how cultural politics work, is this is also interesting for as a lens for the analysis of larger processes in debates that really put museums in a broader political context, and which also affect the work we do as curators, as scholars in this context. And I very much speak here as someone who's considered him as doing an anthropology or who has an engaged understanding of anthropology and also curatorial work. And I think this is something that we share. Maybe I'll stop here, at least for now, and we go into conversation.
Yeah, that's great. So maybe I want to pick up. So maybe I pick up on that again about just addressing how a museum can operate sometimes in an atmosphere of conservative politics, right? That we were describing in Saxony. And coming back to this question of how sometimes the debates around restitution can also then be implicated in other questions of return, right? Around migration and so on. And earlier today, but also in Zurich, we had conversations around how some thinkers and commentators have tried to take the question of that complicity and use it to suggest that perhaps objects should in fact stay within the institutions that currently possess them, and in fact not return them, and instead use them to generate a kind of pedagogy and program around these contemporary urgent issues. So instead of returning objects, leave them in their existing institutions and instead just create public programs around how they might speak to migrants in the city, how they might speak to, so there's a way in which sometimes the museum gets then framed by these other debates. And so I'm just thinking about the way that the restitution works as a conversation in a museum, and then how it gets then taken up outside, and the interaction between both. Yeah.
I think one thing that you addressed that is really important is that restitution oftentimes, and mistakenly so, I think, is seen as like an ending point to something, to a development. So we restitute and then it's been restituted, and that's it. And I think from those instances that restitution has happened, it is totally the other way around. Restitution is part of a much longer process, and I would even say restitution is a process. Because there is no end to it really. It creates something new, and that would be something, I think, there could be a lot to say about this. What you're referring also is like that that of course there's conservative voices co-opting the difficult issues also about restitution for their own ends of arguing against restitution because, of, for example, the fear of objects, for example, after being restituted, landing on the art market. That's something that has been publicly voiced as an argument against restitution. Well, we don't know how the objects are being cared for in the context they have been restituted to, or who knows whether people will sell them. I would respond, well, if they do, it's their business, first of all, and to say, like, we don't know if they can care for them, well, this is not our decision to make. I mean, so it's a very kind of fraught and complicated debate. And in the context of the Bini bronzes, this is part of the debate also because after the transfer of ownership was agreed on a federal level in Germany, the news were that the Nigerian government decided to hand over the ownership to the Oba of Benin. So the heir of the Oba, they have been originally taken from. And this was an argument like, see, we restitute and then it's going into private hands, which is not private on the first hand, it's the kingdom of Benin, and the Oba still has an important political voice in present-day Nigeria, and also like a political function. But it's also like an argument like the ones to judge about what Nigeria is doing after the return of the objects. But interestingly, the argument that you're kind of referring to, having come from an anthropologist in Germany, actually, really made the political sphere insecure of this process, and it carries a lot of weight also, and we have to be aware of that.
Yeah, and also that's also with the other kinds of arguments that's been put forth, right? For example, around almost the design of the process of restitution. We had talked about the way in which you could assign the ownership back to the home government or the home country, but nonetheless to have an object remain in a long-term loan or a long-term holding situation with its existing institution,
Right.
which then it's in some ways gives the existing institution a way to hang on to the objects, right? So
Yes, and there's many of these instances, and I think it's really interesting as a scholar of museums. I would say it's really interesting to kind of go into more to really kind of look into the line of argumentation by museums, because it's really a matter of like how to invest in these politics. And with regards to the case of the Benin bronzes, so there was a politically really far-reaching decision to transfer the ownership rights to the Nigerian state of all Benin bronzes in German holdings, but only to actually return a certain number of objects. So of those, I don't know how many it is, several hundred objects, only maybe 50 would go back first and then some more. And some museum directors were really happy, like, okay, we can transfer the ownership, but the objects actually remain with us. So it's kind of a complicated issue. Of course, there's also very different voices in that instance in Nigeria. Many people say it's really important that those objects would stay also in European museums because they would be appreciated by their audiences. But some say no, they should go back, all of them. We want them back. So it's really not an easy conversation. But for me, the question is really about the, you could say, investment of museums, and so if restitution is seen first and foremost, or the willingness to restitute is the willingness to account for the own implicitness of the own complicity in those acts of colonial violence and loot that museums are complicit with, then it's something that opens up dialogue. And then oftentimes the question of whether or not objects should return is, is being talked about differently.
yeah. Now, I want to come back also to Emeka's work, and then also a little bit to the earlier slide you showed about the care of the objects. The way in which there were these displays that made transparent the procedures and protocols of that conservation. And I thought, perhaps we could talk a bit about the way an artist commission has become part of the process of the strategy of here in Asia, where you invited artists to then address some collection issues?
I think it's a very important question, and I would actually like to start with the artist part of it before the care part, because the care part I think has, it touches upon this very interesting history of the ambivalence of taking care and also doing violence. But I think the artistic, so for us, inviting art, so in Europe or in the ethnographic museum context, it is for a while been a quite popular instrument to invite artists to kind of engage in a renewal process, and also to get people with important names, artists to be part of the project, and kind of also to become more legitimate among certain audiences. And I think that's fair, but the question is like, how far will you get with this if it only stays with kind of a surgical issue of renewal and not like a more broader one. What I find important or interesting, on the other hand, with inviting, and not only artists but collaborators of all sorts, but artists of course with a very own kind of practice of engaging and with more freedom, is that they can do things that museums themselves cannot do so easily. And I will just go back to this one image of Emeka. We invited Emeka Okpo, that was the first invitation, to work with the Dresden State Art Collections on the Benin bronze issue. And he was quite free to do whatever he wanted, and what he did was this missing campaign in the public, as I said before. And basically he could call for restitution. He could say those objects they're missed in Benin, and other than in usual missing campaigns, we know where they are. We know where they are. They are in the holdings of the museums of Dresden and Leipzig. And they need to be, so restitution is something we need to talk about. And we as museums could say, we agree. We couldn't have said that ourselves because it's a state-owned museum, so we are part of the Ministry of Culture. We cannot legally say we want to restitute because it would put, it's just like not, but we can have the art, we can invite the artist to do an intervention that enables us to react. And this was one instance. Another one, and the Para intervention at the Leipzig Museum, where they did like a big exhibition about a missing stone, like the top of the Kilimanjaro mountain in present-day Tanzania, which was chopped off by a Leipzig ethnographer in 1889 who climbed the Kilimanjaro mountain and renamed it in Kaiser Wilhelmspitze, colonial naming, and took off the stone and brought it back to Germany. There's a whole story about it. Nobody knew about this until a while ago. This piece of stone was put on sale in an Austrian antique store for 200,000 euros. So there's supposedly a market for this. And the artist group, they did an intervention, they did an exhibition about that stone, and they called for a restitution of the stone by means of a campaign in the museum to collect the money needed to buy back the stone and transfer it to Tanzania. And they actually managed to lower the price to 40,000 euros. And what they did is they chopped off the top of the highest mountain in Germany, of the Zugspitze, and had it exhibited in a vault in the exhibition. Now, we wouldn't have been able to do this as a museum, as curators, but we were very, very much able to invite artists who came up with that idea and to kind of address the issue of restitution around a piece of stone that nobody had cared for before. And suddenly, so it kind of encapsulated the whole story of provenance, of restitution in that exhibition. And this is something that it was inherently an artistic work.
Yeah, I agree. I thought we could open up for questions, so I'll just ask you one more, and then maybe to along the same lines of thinking about these strategies of decolonizing the museum, that we think of the role of, which in some ways is the current position you have in Zurich as an educator, as a university professor. So thinking the role of how the Grassi had worked with Monica Bonilla as a professor, and the benefit of the way that conversation could bring certain perspectives into the museum, but also the role of the public programs curator or or again back to the question of care, the conservator, right? The ways that these might work, these positions and these folks might have ways in which they could introduce things into a museum that could only intersect with what the exhibition curator does, but then could maybe intervene into it, resist it even, produces contradictions and counterpoints. Yeah. Yes.
I mean, I've always really liked to work with, as a curator, to work with students, and we have been working, Sylvia and I, with students and in the Humboldt lab as well, and in Leipzig as well, with the curatorial studies program of the art school in Leipzig. I think on the one hand, yeah, like scholars and also especially students, PhD students, can bring in very interesting and critical topics into exhibition and kind of steer things up. What I made my experience is also that by addressing their research question in a three-dimensional kind of exhibition mode, can also change the very kind of going about their questions in their further scholarly work. So that is what I found always very interesting, and I think that you can relate to as well, like how curating can serve as a specific way of addressing research question, and the prep room in Singapore is, I think, one really brilliant example of going about research questions in the spatial setup that you will not be able to do elsewhere.
Are there?
Thank you so much. I think a lot of people will have many questions, because it's quite interesting to hear from you, especially from European museum point of view. So I just want to ask you two questions, specifically for the German context. Like, what will happen if the right-wing government lead the country, and what will happen to this kind of policy? Will it end? Or how can you continue that? And number two, I think it will be very important question for this, a few audience here. They are working with the Ministry of Culture. How can you convince the politicians, to follow this kind of reinstitution policy, especially in Germany? And maybe you can share the strategy or tactic with us.
Thank you so much for those two questions. The first one, we are all very afraid of what's going to happen, and it's really hard to kind of say what it specifically will be. What we know from experience is that the right-wing parties, I think it's not only Germany, they are, the cultural ministries are the first ministries they're usually after to appoint ministers of culture, because they very well know that the influence they have politically will be in the cultural field. And we know this, from other parts of the world as well. So being in Saxony, having been in Saxony, this was really like a lingering danger all the time. And it has happened in Germany also. You know, you don't have to have the governing party to be right extremist in order for right extremists to put up a lot of pressure against cultural institutions, and they know how to dominate the cultural sphere, even in the subcultural field. So in large parts of, especially Eastern Germany, in the provinces, the youth clubs, the kind of subcultural field is very much dominated already by right extremist structures, and this has the politics have for many years, decades, have turned a blind eye on this development, and now they're realizing it's a mainstream phenomenon, and there have been coalitions of cultural workers organizing in Germany against those right-wing attacks on cultural institutions. And I think they're very important. And we've been discussing amongst cultural practitioners what do we do? And I think the first order of business is really to be in solidarity with each other and speaking out for each other. And we in Leipzig, we've had attacks. One official political instrument in the parliamentary setting is a so-called small request. So any party can file a so-called small or even large request. That means they are requesting the ministry in charge, for example, a museum, to respond to a certain question they have. And the ministry usually confers this further to the museum in question. And this may be for example, the stone example I told before, that they will address, like, so did the governing body know about this, that they chopped off the stone and put it into display in the museum, and why did they not do anything if they knew, and all this. And we had these requests on a sometimes monthly basis, and of course this is just meant to distract us from our daily work. And these are instances where I think it's really important for museums, but also other cultural institutions to just back up each other. So much to the first question. The second, it's really hard to answer because it relies so heavily on the specific political context with regards to. So the baby bronzes were really the most prominent example of restitution and the most politically far-reaching, where I think museums have started to realize after those long decades of restitution requests, but also of calls from within the museums that restitution is important, that that they have come to realize, like, we don't only have to lose something, but we also can win something. And I think one aspect is to make the governing bodies less scared about the consequences of restitution. And what I said before, that restitution is a process. I mean, let's face it, if we're talking about a collection of, let's say, 100,000 objects, and in Germany 100,000 would even be a smaller collection when it comes to ethnographic museums. How many objects subject to restitution requests are we actually talking about? Maybe 20? Sometimes not even. So, and even if it were 100, which is a lot, or 1,000, we're still talking about this very, very small percentage. And I don't know about the situation here in Germany. The average amount of objects on display in relation to object in holdings is maybe 1%, 2%. So the rest, and many objects in German ethnographic museums have never seen the light of the daylight. I mean, they're not supposed to, but anyways, so many, we have had whole collections to not ever have been unboxed. Partly relating to your care question, partly because they have been intoxicated at the moment of their collecting. So all feathers, have been intoxicated by arsenic, toxic substances in order to be preserved. So you cannot actually work with them. But
there are also other...
there are other instances of the emasculate of objects means that they have just not been really looked at. And so if you look at this history of carelessness, you could say, how does this stand in relation to the standpoint of no, we cannot restitute because if this is often an expressed fear, we cannot restitute one object because tomorrow we have empty holdings. There's no empirical basis for that claim, because usually, and I've been talking to colleagues in the North American, especially Canadian context, where there's a much longer history of restitution towards First Nations community in Canada. And usually what museum directors would say is like, if we do engage in restitution, we win way more than we lose because we first of all start to get respected as a museum by those communities in question. That's the one thing. They start seeing us as someone to actually talk to. And second, oftentimes even there's reciprocity, there's new objects coming in, or artists being commissioned. So the openness for restitution, to answer your question, the openness for restitution oftentimes allows for much more than the actual restitution, if there is ever a restitution happening. Because in many cases, and we've been talking about this before, in many cases people don't even want the objects back. But they want the acknowledgement of the violent history that actually is the basis for the objects to have come into the holdings.
Before you guys ask questions, I just want to share that in Thailand, our case is more like we are in the position of reclaiming, right, of the object mostly from not European museum, but American museum. We got I remember around the 80s, we have the little Thompson, from the Art Institute of Chicago, and they are kindly returned to us. And right now, I think it's kind of going back to the same, right, to Buriram, to the castle, yeah. And then just recently, we have two or three sculptures from the Metropolitan Museum. But it's quite interesting because there was the MOU signed between the Ministry of Culture, Department of Fine Arts, and the Metropolitan Museum, Southeast Asian Department. They kind of start to do a research together, and they're trying to kind of slowly. I don't know how many we will get, and I don't know how many that the museum in the U.S. keep or take for their collection. But it was really a different debate, in Thailand.
Right. And is there knowledge, if I may ask, is there knowledge about the holdings of, for example, Met? So do people here know about all the objects that are actually there?
There was an independent archaeologist, and they are working on it at the moment. Yeah. They're trying to compile the list of some important sculpture that has been trafficked, to the U.S. during the Cold War.
Yes.
That was quite interesting. So I think any questions from the audience, or anyone want to share, maybe from the British or from the French museum perspective. Yeah.
A few years ago, quite a few years ago, I was a magazine editor, and I was invited down to Charing Road, which is the centre of the Thai antiques trading district. And it was for journalists to have a lunch in one of the antique galleries there. And the owner was, she was talking very strongly about how good they were and how bad all the other galleries were, because they did terrible things like have flip books of pictures from actual intact structures in Cambodia, where people could then look through the flip books of photographs and choose the one they wanted chiseled out. And then later, unfortunately, just as we were about to leave, her husband came home from the border from Emanate, and he started showing us flip books, pictures So there are a lot of people who are responsible for a lot of this that are not museums, they're people in the art market. And maybe is there perhaps even more responsibility to look into the art market? I mean, one thing that was interesting you were saying about in ways you don't really mind whether a new owner of this antiques, the object was then put into the art market. But I understand that some objects in the restitution debate aren't necessarily looted objects, but ones which were purchased or sold by people 100 years ago, 150 years ago. Is their choice to sell it then less valid than someone's choice to sell it in the future if it's restituted? That's a horrible, thorny question.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I think one part of my response would be to look very closely into the historical context in which artworks or objects have been sold, especially when it comes to the colonial context. Because of course, when we look into the various few archival records, I mean, the archival records are really poor when it comes to ethnographic objects. But if we look into those, you can't distinguish really easily between legitimate and illegitimate kind of transfer of ownership, you could say. Of course, oftentimes things were bought, but the question of, I have been involved in provenance research projects where we were looking into objects where people doing the research on these objects and even also having ties to the context that they were originally taken or bought from, they look at these objects and say, never would they be voluntarily given away. So I think it's really a matter of looking closely into the context of acquisition historically, and as museums we have, I think it's one way of going about it is to also ask about the cultural the cultural meanings attached to the objects today. And we would have situations in which objects would have never been unboxed or not having been done anything with, that we could say they have been legitimately acquired, or we don't know. But people say today they will be so important for whatever context they are speaking from, and they would want to have them returned, that is something for museums to follow up on and to say, okay, let's talk about return in light of this claim. Another question, another kind of dimension is the question of what happens with those objects once returned if they are being sold to the art market. I mean, I'm not saying I don't mind, but I'm not the one whose opinion really counts. That's maybe a distinguishing aspect here. So if people decide to sell on the private art market, if they're the legitimate holder of the objects, I mean, yes. I can say that in Germany and other contexts I know of, that of course there has been the attempt to, for example, buy or acquire objects from the private field to museums in order to make them accountable, in order to make them not, to kind of extract them from the private sphere. And of course there's a huge market in ethnographic, so-called ethnographic material, which has come to be ethnographic in the moment of, being collected in the first place.
Yeah, but I would also come up and even more strongly say that there are categories of objects that you could entirely exclude from trade or sale because of the materials of the material conditions of these objects. Because one of my interests is looking at things from Southeast Asia in the German collection. And then coming to understand that a number of these objects are essentially of human origin. They are basically human remains. And so there is the question of restitution with these objects, or at least with this object is clear in the way that you can't ever think of a way to display them again in the museum without raising a whole host of very problematic issues, right? That I'm not even sure that the holding institutions have the capacity to address. But then the terrible thing is that on the market, these things I've seen on European auction sites that are still available for sale, right? So just trying to understand what the contemporary, how folks who might hold this in private collections want to do with this, then realizing that there's no mechanism to exclude this from to say that no, these are essentially human remains and they should not be able to sell decorated. But there's no such. So I would just say no, that you could ethically say something shouldn't be sold, something shouldn't be made for auction, something shouldn't be traded.
I absolutely agree, and I think, this is something I haven't touched upon at all, and this opens up a whole new, range of questions how to deal with ancestral remains in museums. And I can only say, for the Saxonian museums, I was part of, like in the Dresden, there's an anthropological holdings where there's the bodies of only from colonial context from 2,500 people in the holdings, body parts. And this is the brutal history of ethnographic museums in Germany. And this is, so I've been talking about, so not, cultural objects in my talk, but of course the whole human remains question. And you're right, it's oftentimes you cannot make this clear-cut distinction because there are cultural objects of which human remains are being part of, and they have a historical, spiritual, whatever meaning in the context they're from. And I have also been witnessing situations where we had visitors come. So we had a large collaboration with a project about objects from Cameroon in German holdings. It's a very important project, co-chaired by Benedict Savoy and Albert Wafo from the University of John in Cameroon. And we're talking about 40,000 objects in German collection of like 45 museums in Germany. The largest collection of Cameroonian objects in the world, more than in any Cameroonian museum. And so we had people visiting us in the Leipzig Museum, and during the visit, we saw human remains in this collection. Nobody had ever seen that in the very depot. So you can imagine how also emotional such a visit can be, and how unprepared you are as a museum for such a moment.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to see you again. Several years ago, I had this debate in Germany, but yes, it's quite difficult and have a lot of complexities. And I have no idea as well, but after, for now, that I only probably for 4 or 5 years, and you now move to Switzerland, how is about the different countries? Because when we talk about colonial collections in the country that have been the empire, the big empire, French collections, British collections, German collection is quite very strong of the what's called race, right? And a lot of things that have colonialism with it. Very, I think, very sad story. And how is about the other country, such as the new of your working now in Switzerland, or I have been visiting some museum, ethnographic museum in Poland, and and would like to come again to study or to do research, but it's COVID-19, so I'm away from that, right? How is about in different countries of Europe who are not the empire or the figures of empire in that way, how they deal with all these different countries or same, I don't know. Please share about this.
Thank you so much for your question. And I mean, we've had that conversation as well with regards to the Swiss Museum. So you're really you're touching upon an issue that is also being discussed in Switzerland a lot. And Switzerland has not been a colonial power commonly known, but of course, Swiss traders, missionaries, researchers have been globally present and collected objects, amassed collections. So we have large and important ethnographic museums in different parts of Switzerland. In Basel, there's 2 museums in Zurich. There's a large museum in Geneva, in Neuchâtel. So you look, and Poland is another example, or Eastern European countries, also other countries where there's important ethnographic collections that are not related to like an official involvement of those countries in colonial history, but nevertheless where collectors, and I always use quotation marks, collectors have been, of course, profiting from colonial infrastructures. Also in Germany, I mean, you know, Alexander von Humboldt was traveling Latin America, even though Germany had no colonial endeavors in Latin America, but he wouldn't have been able to do his journeys without the colonial infrastructure of the Portuguese and the Spanish. And he dug out human remains from graves, as is quite commonly known today. So it's an important question, and this is, I think, why in Switzerland the debate has now caught public attention as well, or has kind of been more important, because Swiss museums, of course, realize that they look back on a history of collecting in like structural relations of power, you could say.
Yeah, I would also say that the museums,
Yes, I'm sorry.
I would also say that the museums that would, you know, within these countries that claim neutrality or claim the safety of not being an empire, sometimes their ethnographic displays suffer from the same issues as what you might find like in Germany or elsewhere. In that one, like my experience of walking through the Zurich Ethnographic Museum with Fred was that it has a way of basically foregrounding the role of the curator and their attempt to do right much more than getting the home or the source communities to speak, you know. So it's still nonetheless about that person, that curator talking about how we need to do all these things, but there's no one else. So even though it's speaking about an Asian question, there's no other Asian voices based bluntly put, right, in that space speaking, you know. And the other thing also is that and I went to look at the collections in Sweden, and the Swedes had run a very successful East Indies company themselves for 50 years. And that history is in some ways under-excited because we always pay attention to, at least here, to the major East Indies company. We pay attention to the Dutch one, to the British one, and so on. But it made Gothenburg a very wealthy city. Also in terms of the amount of objects it amassed through just purchase and the same kind of trade in artifacts and exotic objects. And when you enter those spaces to look at the display and the collection, they foreground the role of the explorer as a heroic, you know, bringing back of culture to educate their home city yeah, all kinds of other ways you can think of displaying and getting these objects to speak. Yeah.
And this is made, but I think Sylvia also had a question or remark. Do you want to? But I would have something to follow up in a minute.
Yeah, maybe also a thorny one, because I think that's a legitimate question about the art market. And the other question would be, if you're talking about the right, you also have to talk about the global right, and that the right also has a transnational sphere. So I was wondering, because we're seeing this in Europe, that in Poland or Hungary, that the museum sphere and especially the art sphere is very much politicized, also by the right wing. And I was wondering, thinking about India, if you would talk about restituting to India and having this right-wing BJP government there, which is rewriting Indian history, which is like using cultural history to create this image of a Hindu nationalistic state, also historically, and rewriting citizenship and all the things, So this is also something, you can't really say. So yeah, restitution is really complicated. What do you do if these artifacts are being used to create this new version of Indian history? And at the same time, I really like what you said, Jason, that there is also a migrant city population within Leipzig and within these cities who might also relate to these objects in a different way. So it was like, it's complicated. This is probably the other side to the art market, where you can also make the democratic argument, right? Once it leaves the public sphere, it's kind of gone. But the other thorny question would be about what to do with these, how to deal with the global right.
Yes.
Sorry.
It's to put it another way, maybe it's not only complicated, but it needs complication, or the issues need a complication of line of thinking. And I like what, and Wayne Modest, we've been talking about Wayne Modest before, who's in charge of the 3 ethnographic museums in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, Amsterdam, and Leiden. And he's been talking about museums and their importance in a kind of different way of belonging work. They are invested in issues of addressing their fraud history as much as they're invested in enabling new kinds of belonging work or new kinds of transversal identification processes in the very location that they're in a post-migrant society. And of course they enable people to connect with works or with objects in ways they have not originally meant to be connected with, but they create new narratives and new possibilities. And I would say, but yes, and I would not say, however, that the debate about restitution and these kind of developments should be kind of argued against each other, which is often done, which is sometimes done, especially within the field of cultural anthropology also. And I think that's kind of the slippery slope we need just to be aware of, like, where we say the question is, what is the investment of putting forward a certain argument? And I would say it really depends on what is the investment. And of course, there possibly can be claims for restitution that are following a very conservative line of, like, essentialist line of thinking, or as we even say with regards to the Hindu nationalist kind of context in India, to reaffirm such a vision, and that's of course problematic, and it opens this debate of who is actually a legitimate party to file a restitution request. Now, it's still an internet, I mean, as we all know probably, is that with regards to colonial context, there's no international, like even soft law agreements like the Washington Principles on National Socialist confiscated art from 1998. This is not existing for colonial collections. So basically, it's only states that can engage with each other when it comes to these questions, and not private parties, as the Washington Agreement enables them to do. So, successors or heirs to people who have lost something cannot address a national government. Only the state will, and that's one problem. And that's maybe also a problem regarding the issue that you're raising. It would only be a state player to file those requests.
Well, I have maybe like a small answer, which is that maybe one way to engage with that question is to find ways in which that question isn't simply one that is between museum folks or between folks involving in government or cultural ministries, but to make sure that this question is being contextualized and discussed. And I want to have first an example from 2023, when newspapers in Asia were reporting that there was some investigation within the Asian Civilization Museum in Singapore, but also with the folks from government officials in India. They are looking specifically at the provenance of some materials being held by ACM that are Hindu and from, I believe, from Tamil Nadu. But then when you read the reports, there isn't a contextualizing of how this might be part of this specific government's interest in, pursuing artifacts linked to one thing, but not necessarily another one. Do you know what I mean? So they might not pursue something that might be related to, of other faiths and other with other histories. So if there was that kind of journalism, right, that could make evident what this specific thing could be about, this specific trajectory could be about, then the debate could be had. Right? Otherwise, we would just accept it, thinking that, oh, this is having seen this in isolation, you would think, yes, this is a justifiable restitution.
One more question, the last question. More comments?
Thank you so much. Agree with you and your question. Another side that I asked you a question in the context of Europe. When I came back, this issue also come with me. And when we see, especially in Thailand, this is not quite easy because another colonialist still here. Long times of history, we also have several critical heritage, and it's not easy to connect with people or local communities, or even the extinction issue still stuck in the level of, like you say, in the nation state, nationalism, maybe not very much connect to as maybe we need more anthropological work to do like this. We see something like good science in other big areas such as art, right? When we and there's another side that also difficult as well, not only in Europe.
More questions? Okay, so I think, yeah, thank you so much for your attentive, listeners and participants, and thank you so much for the conversation, to give us more food for thought, and